Some families build their success on lies, and mine was a masterpiece of deception. The words echoed in my mind as I adjusted my dress shirt, staring into the mirror of my modest Denver apartment. My name is Marcus Reeves, 47 years old, a veteran of 3 tours in Afghanistan, now working as a cybersecurity consultant. For years, I'd watched my younger brother Eric live a life that seemed touched by golden light. Top-tier MBA, executive position at a Fortune 500 tech company, parents who spoke of him like he was nothing short of a miracle. I'd never been the golden child. While Eric was collecting academic awards and climbing corporate ladders, I was in the military, then grinding through night classes and contract work. My parents' conversations always seemed to drift towards Eric's latest achievement, another promotion, another accolade, another milestone that made their eyes shine with an pride that never quite extended to me. The invitation to his 40th birthday gala had arrived 3 weeks ago, an elaborate affair at the Denver Country Club, complete with a guest list that read like a who's who of Colorado's tech elite. My mother had called, her voice trembling with excitement. "Marcus, you'll come, won't you? Eric's going to make a big announcement." Something in her tone felt different, urgent, almost desperate. I knew every inch of my brother's story, or so I thought. Adopted as an infant, sure, but brought into our family so young that it never felt like a distinction. My parents had always been transparent about the adoption, or so they claimed. Eric was their miracle child, rescued from a difficult situation, raised with every possible advantage. They'd remortgaged their house to send him to the best schools, funded his entire education, covered his first down payment on a $1 million home in Cherry Creek. My own path had been different. Military service, then community college, then working my way up through cybersecurity contracts. Every dollar I earned was hard-fought, every achievement the result of relentless effort. While Eric's life seemed effortless, mine was a constant battle against expectations, against financial constraints, against the shadow of my brother's seemingly perfect existence. The cybersecurity work had taught me more than just protecting digital networks. It had refined my ability to dig, to uncover, to see beyond the surface. My latest contract with a government agency had only sharpened those skills: pattern recognition, data analysis, understanding what people wanted to hide. Something had been brewing in my family for months. Subtle changes. My mother's increasingly anxious phone calls, my father's forced cheerfulness, Eric's sudden nervousness during our rare family gatherings, small tells that most would miss, but not me. Not someone trained to read between the lines. I'd spent years collecting fragments, old documents, conversations overheard, digital breadcrumbs. Not out of malice, but out of a persistent feeling that something wasn't adding up. The adoption story had always seemed too neat, too perfect. My parents' narrative about finding Eric through a private agency, the sealed records, the lack of detailed information, it all felt constructed. My military training had taught me patience, observation, the art of waiting for the right moment. And now, as I prepared for Eric's birthday gala, I knew something was going to break. The tension had been building, a pressure cooker ready to explode. The cybersecurity work had given me tools most wouldn't have. Access to databases, connections, ways of tracing information that most people couldn't imagine. I'd been methodical, careful. Collecting evidence wasn't about revenge. It was about understanding the truth. My hand traced the scar on my forearm, a reminder from my second tour, a constant companion that told stories of survival, of pushing through when everything seemed impossible. I'd survived moments that would break most men. This family mystery was just another mission, another puzzle to be solved. The invitation to the gala was more than just a birthday celebration. It was an opportunity, a chance to understand the carefully constructed narrative that had defined our family dynamics for decades. Eric's big announcement, my parents' nervous excitement. Something was coming, and I was going to be ready. I adjusted my tie, a gift from my last military unit, simple, functional. Unlike the designer brands Eric preferred, my life had always been about substance over style, about earning respect through action rather than presentation. As I grabbed my keys, a stack of carefully organized documents sat on my home office desk. Birth certificates, adoption records, fragmentary evidence collected over years of careful investigation, not a weapon, but a tool for understanding, for revealing the truth that had been hidden in plain sight for 4 decades. The drive to the Denver Country Club would be familiar. I'd made this journey countless times before, but tonight would be different. Tonight, everything would change. The Denver Country Club gleamed with an artificial perfection that made my skin crawl. Chandeliers dripped crystal, waiters glided between clusters of Colorado's elite, and at the center of it all stood Eric, impeccably dressed, a champagne flute in hand, looking every bit the successful tech executive my parents had always bragged about. I'd spent years building a network of contacts that would make most intelligence operatives jealous. My cybersecurity work meant connections, private investigators, data analysts, legal researchers who could find information others couldn't. The investigation into Eric's past hadn't been a sudden impulse, but a methodical process that had taken years of careful research. My first real suspicion had emerged 3 years ago during a routine family gathering. A casual comment from my aunt, quickly hushed by my mother, about Eric's real origins had been the first crack in the perfect family narrative. Most would have let it go, but I wasn't most people. My military training had taught me that inconsistencies were never accidents. Digital forensics became my primary tool. I'd spent months tracing adoption records, cross-referencing databases, building a picture that my parents had worked desperately to conceal. Each piece of information was carefully documented, verified, cross-checked. The sealed adoption records should have been impossible to penetrate, but nothing was truly impossible for someone with my skills and determination. The first significant breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A retired social worker in Colorado Springs who had worked with private adoption agencies in the late 1970s. She remembered something, a complicated case involving a wealthy family, sealed records, unusual circumstances. The details were fragmentary, but they didn't match the story my parents had told for years. My brother Eric had always been the golden child, top of his class at Stanford, recruited by major tech companies before graduation. A network of powerful connections that seemed to open every possible door. My parents had remortgaged their house twice to support his education, sold family heirlooms to fund his first startup. Every resource, every opportunity had been channeled toward Eric. I remembered the contrast of my own path. Military service, followed by night classes, building my cybersecurity career contract by contract. While Eric attended charity galas and tech conferences, I was tracking digital threats for government agencies, living a life of quiet competence. The evidence had been accumulating for months. Birth certificates with subtle inconsistencies, adoption records with strategic redactions, financial transactions that didn't quite add up. Each piece was a puzzle, and I was determined to see the complete picture. My military background had taught me patience. In Afghanistan, I'd spent weeks gathering intelligence, understanding complex human networks, reading what wasn't said as much as what was spoken. Those skills translated perfectly to unraveling my family's most guarded secret. The private investigator I'd quietly hired had confirmed my suspicions. Eric wasn't just adopted. The circumstances of his adoption were far more complicated than my parents had ever admitted. Sealed records, unusual financial transactions, a narrative carefully constructed to hide something significant. As I moved Through the country club, I observed the guests, Eric's colleagues, my parents' friends, a world of carefully maintained appearances. They saw a successful family. I saw a house of cards waiting to collapse. Each conversation, each interaction was a potential source of information. My brother caught my eye from across the room. For a moment, something flickered in his expression, a mix of nervousness and anticipation. He knew something was coming. The carefully constructed facade was about to crack. The birthday cake stood in the center of the room, an elaborate creation that probably cost more than my first year's rent. 40 candles flickered, each representing a year of a life built on a foundation of secrets. Eric would make his announcement soon, and I would be ready. My hand unconsciously touched the manila folder hidden inside my jacket. Years of research, months of careful investigation. The truth was about to become undeniable, and nothing would remain the same after tonight. The moment arrived with a precision that felt choreographed. Eric tapped a crystal champagne flute, the sound cutting through the ambient chatter of the country club's main ballroom. "I have an announcement," he said, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of a corporate executive used to commanding attention. I watched my parents, my father standing slightly behind my mother, both radiating a mixture of pride and tension. Years of careful observation had taught me to read the minute details most people missed, the slight tremble in my mother's hand, the way my father's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Eric continued, "I'm launching a new tech foundation, a scholarship program for underprivileged students." The crowd murmured approvingly. Another golden moment for the golden child. But I knew better. The timing was deliberate. The announcement was a smokescreen. My research had uncovered far more than a simple adoption story. The documents in my jacket pocket told a different narrative, one of calculated deception that stretched back decades. I'd spent months tracing financial records, tracking down obscure contacts, piecing together a puzzle that my parents had worked desperately to keep hidden. The private investigator I'd hired had been thorough. Birth certificates, sealed adoption records, unusual financial transactions that defied simple explanation. Each piece of evidence was meticulously documented, verified through multiple sources. My cybersecurity background meant I knew how to build a case that couldn't be easily dismissed. As Eric spoke, I remembered the countless family gatherings, the way my parents would beam with pride, showering him with attention and resources. My own achievements, military service, a successful cybersecurity career, always felt secondary, a footnote to Eric's seemingly charmed life. My military training had taught me patience, the art of waiting for the perfect moment, of understanding that information was a weapon more powerful than any physical tool. I'd tracked insurgents through the mountains of Afghanistan. Unraveling a family secret was almost too easy by comparison. The first crack in the facade had appeared 3 years ago. A casual comment from an elderly aunt, quickly hushed by my mother. Fragments of a conversation overheard at a family gathering. Small inconsistencies that most would overlook, but not someone trained to detect subtle tells. I moved closer to the stage, my movements calculated. Eric was mid-speech, talking about opportunity and social responsibility. The irony wasn't lost on me. He had no idea what was coming. The manila folder felt heavy in my hand. Years of investigation compressed into a few sheets of paper. Birth certificates with strategic redactions. Financial records that told a story of calculated manipulation. Adoption documents that revealed a truth my parents had worked decades to conceal. My mother caught my eye. For a moment, something like fear flickered across her face. She knew, somehow she knew I was about to shatter everything. As Eric finished his speech, the applause was thunderous. Another triumph for the golden child. But triumph was about to turn to exposure. I stepped forward, my military bearing giving me a presence that commanded attention. "Before we celebrate," I said, my voice cutting through the applause, "there's something everyone should know about. Eric's adoption." The room went silent. Eric's smile froze. My parents stopped breathing. I pulled out the manila folder. "Not everything is as it seems," I said, my voice steady. The first document was already in my hand, a birth certificate that would change everything. The confrontation was about to begin. Years of secrets were about to be exposed, and nothing would remain the same after this moment. My hand was steady. My resolve was absolute. The truth was a weapon more powerful than any I'd carried in Afghanistan, and I was about to use it. The silence was deafening. My words hung in the air like a suspended weapon, ready to detonate the carefully constructed facade of our family's perfect narrative. Eric's face transformed, from confident executive to a man suddenly stripped bare, exposed in front of everything and everyone he'd ever known. I'd spent years preparing for this moment, not out of malice, but out of a deep-seated need to understand the truth. My cybersecurity work had taught me that every system has vulnerabilities, every narrative has hidden fractures. Families were no different. The first document I pulled from the folder was a birth certificate, not the one my parents had shown us for years, but an original document they'd worked desperately to suppress. It revealed inconsistencies that would shatter everything: a different birthplace, a different set of biological parents, details that didn't align with the story Eric had been told his entire life. My mother made a small sound, half gasp, half sob. My father's hand gripped the back of a nearby chair, his knuckles turning white. The guests at the country club birthday gala looked on, transformed from celebrants to unwitting witnesses of a family's most intimate destruction. "The adoption wasn't what you've been told," I said, my voice carrying the same calm I'd used during high-stakes military operations. "The records show a completely different story." Each word was a calculated strike, precisely aimed to expose the truth. Years of investigation had led to this moment. I'd traced financial transactions that suggested a far more complicated adoption process. Payments to private agencies, sealed records, hushed conversations, the kind of intricate web that spoke of something more than a simple, loving adoption. Eric tried to speak, but no words came out. The confident tech executive was gone, replaced by a man suddenly confronting the fundamental lie of his existence. I watched as the reality began to sink in. The life he thought he knew was built on a foundation of carefully constructed deception. My own path had been different. Military service, hard work, building a career through sheer determination. While Eric had been handed every opportunity, I'd learned that nothing was given, everything had to be earned. That lesson now played out in the most personal way possible. The private investigator I'd hired had been thorough. Birth records, financial transactions, sealed adoption documents, each piece of evidence meticulously verified, cross-referenced, built into an irrefutable case. The kind of investigation that would stand up to the most intense scrutiny. My parents had always presented Eric as the perfect son, top of his class, Stanford graduate, tech executive with a golden touch. But perfection, I'd learned, was often the most elaborate disguise. The documents in my hand told a story of strategic manipulation, a narrative carefully crafted to hide something fundamental. "There are gaps in the adoption story," I continued, my voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Payments that don't make sense, connections that were never explained." Each word was a surgical strike, designed to expose the truth without mercy. The country club's elegant ballroom had become a battlefield, not the kind I'd fought in during my military tours, but equally devastating. Families, I'd learned, could be more complex than any military operation, more treacherous, more personal. My mother took a step forward, her hand outstretched. "Marcus, please," she whispered. But it was too late. The truth was already in motion, unstoppable as a missile locked onto its target. Eric's colleagues looked on, their perfect evening transformed into a spectacle of family revelation. The carefully curated image of success was crumbling piece by piece, and I was the one holding the demolition switch. "Who am I?" Eric finally managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the air, a raw, fundamental challenge. Do everything he thought he knew. I pulled out the next document: birth records, financial transactions, adoption paperwork. Each page was a piece of a puzzle that would rewrite everything. The truth was about to become undeniable, and I was going to make sure every single detail was exposed. The aftermath was like watching a controlled demolition. Except this wasn't a building. It was an entire family's carefully constructed reality. Within 48 hours of the country club revelation, our family's world had been completely dismantled. Eric's tech company placed him on immediate administrative leave. His professional network, those same connections he'd cultivated so meticulously, began to distance themselves with surgical precision. The golden boy was tarnished, his reputation becoming radioactive overnight. My investigative work had uncovered more than just adoption inconsistencies. There were financial trails that suggested a complex web of deceit, payments to private agencies, unusual money transfers, communications that hinted at a narrative far more complicated than a simple adoption. I'd learned patience in Afghanistan. Tracking insurgents through mountain passes taught you that truth was a weapon more precise than any rifle. My cybersecurity background gave me tools most would never understand. The ability to trace digital breadcrumbs, to follow financial transactions that seemed to vanish into thin air. My parents retreated into a shocked silence. Their perfect narrative, the son they'd presented to the world, the family legacy they'd carefully constructed, had been reduced to ash in a matter of moments. Their phone calls stopped. Their emails became terse, defensive. The mask of suburban perfection had been irrevocably shattered. Eric's attempts to contact me were desperate. Voicemails that started professional, then devolved into raw emotion. "I need to understand," he'd say. "What did you find?" But understanding wasn't something I was prepared to give easily. Not after years of being the overlooked son, the one who was always secondary to his golden achievements. The private investigator I'd hired had been worth every penny. Birth certificates with strategic redactions, financial records that told a story of manipulation, sealed adoption documents that revealed a truth my parents had worked decades to conceal. My military training had taught me that information was the most powerful weapon. I'd tracked insurgents through impossible terrain, uncovered networks that seemed impenetrable. Compared to that, unraveling my family's secrets was almost too simple. The first real crack in their story had appeared 3 years ago. A casual comment from an elderly aunt, a hushed conversation at a family gathering, small inconsistencies that most would overlook, but not someone trained to detect the subtlest of tells. I received a call from a local journalist, someone who had heard whispers about the country club confrontation. "Would you be willing to go on record?" she asked. The temptation was there to expose everything, but exposure wasn't my ultimate goal. Truth was, my cybersecurity work had taught me that every system has vulnerabilities. Families were no different. The narrative they'd constructed was a complex network, and I'd found its critical points of failure. Eric's attempts to negotiate came next. Desperate phone calls, emails that started professional, then became increasingly personal. "We can work this out," he'd say, but there was nothing to work out. The truth had been released, and it couldn't be contained. My mother's breakdown came 2 weeks after the country club incident, a long, rambling phone call that revealed more than she intended. Fragments of a story that had been hidden for decades, hints of a complicated adoption process, Payments that didn't make sense, connections that were never fully explained. I'd spent years building a case, not out of malice, but out of a fundamental need to understand. Each document was a piece of a puzzle, each financial transaction a clue to a larger narrative. The fallout was just beginning. Eric's professional network had become a minefield. His tech company, the same one he'd climbed so carefully, was conducting an internal investigation. His credentials were suspended. His reputation was in tatters. My father tried to approach me once, a meeting at a small coffee shop in Denver. "You've destroyed everything," he said. But destruction wasn't my goal. Exposure was. The truth doesn't care about comfort. It doesn't negotiate. It simply exists, waiting to be revealed. And I was the one holding the key to its release. The real story wasn't about adoption. It was about a web of lies so intricate that it had defined an entire family's existence for decades. My investigation had uncovered layers of complexity that went far beyond a simple misrepresented adoption. Financial records showed a pattern of payments that suggested something more sinister, a deliberate orchestration of Eric's entire life trajectory. The money trails led to private schools, college recommendations, even early career opportunities. Nothing about Eric's success had been accidental. I spent weeks in my home office, surrounded by digital forensics equipment that would make most cybersecurity experts jealous. Each document was a thread in a larger tapestry of deception. Bank statements, communication logs, legal documents, each piece told a fragment of a story that was more complex than I'd initially imagined. My military background had taught me that intelligence was never about a single piece of information. It was about understanding the connections, the networks, the underlying systems that truly drove human behavior. Eric's life was a carefully constructed algorithm, programmed by our parents from the moment he entered our family. The most shocking revelation came from an unexpected source, a retired social worker in Colorado Springs who had worked with private adoption agencies in the late 1970s. Her casual mention of a complicated case involving a wealthy family with sealed records became the key that unlocked everything. Eric's biological background was nothing like we'd been told. The birth certificate I'd uncovered revealed parents from a completely different socioeconomic background, a narrative that stood in stark contrast to the carefully crafted story my parents had maintained for decades. It wasn't just an adoption, it was a calculated acquisition. My cybersecurity contacts helped me trace digital breadcrumbs that seemed to disappear. Financial transactions that appeared and vanished. Communication networks that existed in the shadows. Each piece of information was meticulously verified, cross-referenced, built into an irrefutable case. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent years being the overlooked son, the one who'd built his life through military service and hard work. Eric had been handed everything, and now I was the one holding the key to his entire existence. Our parents had always been strategic. I remembered family gatherings where every conversation seemed carefully choreographed. Eric's achievements weren't just celebrated, they were performed, a narrative being constructed in real time, with our entire extended family as unwitting audience members. The private investigator I'd hired had been thorough beyond my initial expectations. Birth records, financial transactions, sealed documents that suggested a level of manipulation that went beyond typical family dynamics. This was something else entirely, a systematic reconstruction of an entire human life. I traced the initial adoption through a network of private agencies that specialized in discreet placements for wealthy families. The payments were sophisticated, spread across multiple accounts, disguised as consulting fees, educational grants, a financial magic trick that would make most forensic accountants dizzy. Eric's entire professional network began to unravel. Tech companies he'd worked with started asking questions. Investors he'd courted became suspicious. The golden boy was suddenly under a microscope, and every achievement was being re-examined. My mother's desperate phone calls became more frequent, fragments of confession mixed with pleas for understanding. "You don't know everything," she'd say. But I knew more than she could imagine. Each conversation was another piece of evidence, another crack in their carefully constructed narrative. The military had taught me patience. In Afghanistan, I'd learned that information was more powerful than any weapon. I'd tracked networks more complex than this, insurgent communication lines that seemed impossible to penetrate. Compared to that, my family's secrets were almost trivial. I discovered connections that went beyond our immediate family, influential friends who had helped shape Eric's path, recommendations that seemed coincidental but were anything but, a network of enablers who had participated in this elaborate fiction. The most devastating evidence was financial. Not just the adoption payments, but a systematic investment in Eric's entire life trajectory. School recommendations, college admissions, early career opportunities, all carefully orchestrated. Our parents hadn't just adopted a child, they had essentially purchased a future. Eric's attempts to negotiate became more desperate. Phone calls that started professional, then devolved into raw emotion. "What do you want?" he'd ask. But want wasn't the right word. I was after something far more fundamental, the truth. As the weeks passed, the fallout continued. Eric's professional world collapsed. His tech company placed him on indefinite leave. Investors pulled back. The network he'd so carefully constructed began to disintegrate. I wasn't driven by revenge. I was driven by a need to understand, to expose a truth that had been hidden for decades, a truth that had defined our entire family's existence. And I was just getting started. The final confrontation happened in a nondescript conference room in downtown Denver. Neutral territory, if such a thing could exist in our fractured family landscape. Eric arrived first, looking nothing like the polished tech executive I'd seen at the country club. His carefully constructed image had crumbled, gone with the designer suits, replaced by wrinkled clothing that spoke of sleepless nights and constant stress. His tech company had placed him on indefinite leave. The professional network he'd cultivated so carefully had become a minefield of suspicion and withdrawn opportunities. I'd spent months preparing for this moment, not out of a desire for revenge, but from a fundamental need to understand. My military training had taught me that intelligence was about more than information. It was about understanding the human system behind the data. The documents were spread between us. Birth certificates, financial records, adoption papers, each page a piece of evidence that told a story far more complex than a simple family secret. The truth was a weapon more precise than any I'd carried in Afghanistan. "Who am I?" Eric asked, his voice stripped of its previous confidence. The question hung in the air, raw, fundamental, the kind of query that could destroy or rebuild an entire understanding of self. I discovered more than just the circumstances of his adoption. The investigation had uncovered a systematic process of life engineering. Our parents hadn't just adopted a child, they had essentially purchased a future. Every school recommendation, every early career opportunity, each step carefully orchestrated. The private investigator I'd hired had been worth every penny. Sealed records, hushed conversations, financial transactions that told a story of calculated manipulation. The kind of comprehensive investigation that would stand up to the most intense scrutiny. Eric's biological background was nothing like we'd been told. The birth certificate revealed parents from a completely different socio-economic background, a narrative that stood in stark contrast to the carefully crafted story our parents had maintained for decades. "Your entire life was a performance," I said, my voice calm and measured. "Every achievement, every opportunity, carefully constructed by our parents." The words landed like precision strikes. He tried to interrupt, but I continued. "Financial. Records showed a pattern of payments that went beyond typical adoption processes. Private schools, college recommendations, early career introductions, all strategically placed like pieces on a carefully designed chessboard. My cybersecurity background had given me tools most would never understand. The ability to trace digital breadcrumbs, to follow financial transactions that seemed to vanish into thin air. I'd tracked more complex networks in my military service, insurgent communication lines that seemed impossible to penetrate. Eric's world had already begun to collapse. His tech company was conducting an internal investigation. Investors were pulling back. The network he'd cultivated so carefully was disintegrating with surgical precision. "Do you want to know the real story?" I asked. It wasn't a question seeking permission. It was a statement of inevitable revelation. The documents told a story of calculated acquisition. Our parents hadn't just adopted a child, they had essentially purchased a future, a living, breathing project designed to fulfill their own unfulfilled ambitions. I was the son who'd built his life through hard work and military service. Eric was the carefully manufactured dream. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The confident executive was gone. What remained was a man confronting the fundamental lie of his entire existence. I pulled out the final piece of evidence, a series of financial transactions that traced back to our parents, payments to private agencies, strategic investments in Eric's education and early career. A systematic process of life engineering that went beyond typical parental support. Every achievement, I said, was part of a larger design. The words were clinical, precise. Years of military and cybersecurity training had taught me the value of emotional detachment. Eric's world was collapsing. His professional network was becoming a minefield. Tech companies he'd worked with were asking questions. Investors were pulling back. The golden boy was suddenly under a microscope, and every achievement was being re-examined. The confrontation wasn't about destruction, it was about exposure, about understanding the complex system that had defined our entire family's existence. "Who am I?" Eric asked again. But this time the question was different, no longer a plea. Now it was a genuine search for understanding. And I was about to tell him everything. The world Eric had known ceased to exist in the weeks following our confrontation. His carefully constructed life unraveled like a cheap sweater, each thread pulling away to reveal the manufactured reality beneath. I watched from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with a clinical detachment born of years of military and cybersecurity training. Information was a weapon, and I had unleashed an entire arsenal. His tech company didn't just place him on administrative leave. They conducted a full forensic investigation into every achievement, every contract, every recommendation. The golden boy's resume became a document of suspicion. Investors who had once championed him now treated his name like a toxic asset. My investigation had uncovered more than just the circumstances of his adoption. It was a comprehensive deconstruction of a life built on strategic manipulation. Every school admission, every professional recommendation, each career milestone, all carefully orchestrated by our parents, the retired social worker in Colorado. Springs became a critical witness. Her casual mention of a complicated adoption case involving a wealthy family with sealed records transformed into a pivotal piece of evidence. The legal implications were massive. Our parents went into complete retreat. Their social circles, once a carefully maintained network of influence and status, began to fracture. Whispers spread through country club conversations. Dinner parties became minefields of unspoken judgment. I'd learned in my military service that information warfare was more devastating than any physical conflict. Reputations could be destroyed more thoroughly than any building. Eric's professional network became a graveyard of burned bridges and withdrawn opportunities. The financial trail was the most damning evidence. Payments to private agencies, strategic investments in Eric's education and early career, a systematic process of life engineering that went far beyond typical parental support. My cybersecurity contacts helped trace digital breadcrumbs that seemed to disappear into thin air. Eric's attempts to rebuild were futile. Each job interview became an interrogation. Each potential opportunity came with heightened scrutiny. The carefully constructed narrative of the golden child had been completely dismantled. I wasn't driven by revenge. My motivation was purely about exposure, about understanding the complex system that had defined our entire family's existence. Years of military intelligence work had taught me that truth was the most powerful weapon. Our mother's breakdown came in stages. First, desperate phone calls, then silence, then a series of rambling letters that revealed more about the adoption than she ever intended. Fragments of a story that had been hidden for decades. The legal implications began to mount. Questions about the original adoption, investigations into the financial transactions. The carefully sealed records were now being pried open by multiple interested parties. My father tried to negotiate. Meetings in quiet coffee shops, hushed conversations about family reputation. But the time for negotiation had long passed. I was a weapon of truth, precision-guided and relentless. Eric's attempt to fight back was almost pathetic. Lawyers' letters, threats of lawsuits, but the evidence was overwhelming. Each document I'd collected was a nail in the coffin of his previous existence. The most shocking revelations came from unexpected sources, extended family members who had known pieces of the truth but remained silent, family friends who had suspected something but never spoke up. My cybersecurity background proved invaluable, tracing digital footprints, following money trails that seemed to vanish, breaking through layers of digital obfuscation that would have stopped most investigators. The local media picked up the story. What started as whispers became front-page news. Eric's carefully constructed identity became a cautionary tale about manufactured success and familial deception. Our extended family fractured. Thanksgiving gatherings became impossible. Holiday conversations became minefields of unspoken tensions. The family network we'd once maintained collapsed under the weight of revealed truth. I watched it all with the same detachment I'd maintained during covert operations in Afghanistan. Information was a weapon, and I had unleashed an entire arsenal. Eric's final attempt to reclaim his narrative came in a long, rambling email. A desperate plea for understanding, but understanding wasn't what I was after. Truth was the only currency that mattered. The fallout continued. Professional networks, social circles, family relationships, everything Eric had known was now a landscape of destruction, and I was the architect of that destruction, not through malice, but through an uncompromising pursuit of truth. The legal proceedings began like a slow-moving storm, gathering momentum with each passing week. My military discipline translated perfectly into a methodical approach to dismantling our family's carefully constructed narrative. Eric's attempts to salvage his reputation became increasingly desperate. He hired a team of lawyers, conducted media interviews, tried to spin the narrative, but the evidence was overwhelming, a mountain of documentation that left no room for interpretation. I'd spent years building a case that was more than just a collection of documents. It was a comprehensive deconstruction of a life built on strategic manipulation. Every school admission, every professional recommendation, each career milestone, all carefully orchestrated by our parents, now laid bare for the world to see. They, retired social worker from Colorado Springs, became a pivotal witness. Her casual comment about a complicated adoption case transformed into a critical piece of evidence that sent shockwaves through legal circles. The sealed records our parents had worked decades to protect were now being forcibly opened. Our mother's mental state deteriorated. Desperate phone calls gave way to silence. Then came the rambling letters, fragments of a story she'd kept hidden for decades. Each communication revealed more than she intended, adding another layer to the complex narrative of Eric's manufactured existence. My cybersecurity background proved to be the ultimate weapon. I traced digital footprints that seemed to vanish into thin air. Financial transactions that appeared untraceable suddenly became crystal clear. The same skills I'd used to track insurgent networks in Afghanistan now dismantled my family's most guarded secrets. The legal team I'd assembled was relentless. Former military JAG officers, forensic accountants, private investigators with connections that stretched across multiple states. Each professional brought a unique skill set to unraveling the complex web of deception. Eric's professional world continued to collapse. Tech companies he'd worked with conducted exhaustive investigations. Investors withdrew support. Professional networks he'd cultivated for years became toxic wastelands of suspicion and judgment. Our father attempted to negotiate. Hushed meetings in quiet Denver coffee shops, conversations about family reputation, about containing the damage, but negotiation was no longer an option. The truth had become an unstoppable force. The financial trail was the most damning evidence. Payments to private agencies, strategic investments in Eric's education and early career, a systematic process of life engineering that went far beyond typical parental support. Each document was a precision-guided missile targeting the facade of our family's narrative. Local media transformed the story into a cautionary tale about manufactured success and familial deception. What began as whispers became front-page news. Eric's carefully constructed identity became a case study in systemic manipulation. Extended family members began to come forward. Pieces of information that had been buried for years suddenly surfaced. Aunts, uncles, distant cousins, each providing another fragment of the complex puzzle we'd been living. The legal proceedings revealed layers of complexity that went beyond the initial adoption story, financial malfeasance, potential fraud in educational and professional recommendations. The scope of the investigation expanded far beyond our initial understanding. Eric's mental state became a subject of public speculation. Once the golden child of Denver's tech scene, he was now a cautionary tale. Professional opportunities dried up. Social networks collapsed. The carefully constructed identity he'd maintained for years crumbled completely. My military training had taught me the value of patience. Intelligence work wasn't about immediate gratification, it was about methodical exposure. Each piece of evidence carefully placed, each revelation strategically timed. The psychological impact on our family was total. Holiday gatherings became impossible. Family conversations became minefields of unspoken tension. The network we'd once maintained collapsed under the weight of revealed truth. Forensic accountants discovered financial manipulations that went back decades. Payments, strategic investments, a systematic approach to engineering Eric's entire life trajectory. The scale of the deception was breathtaking. I wasn't driven by revenge. My motivation was purely about exposure, about understanding the complex system that had defined our entire family's existence. Truth was the only currency that mattered. As the legal proceedings continued, I realized this was about more than just Eric or our parents. It was about exposing a system of privilege and manipulation that had allowed such a comprehensive deception to exist for decades. The final chapters were still being written, but the narrative had irrevocably changed. Eric's life, once a carefully constructed performance, was now a cautionary tale about the dangers of manufactured success, and I was the architect of that exposure, not through malice, but through an uncompromising pursuit of truth. 1 year after the country club revelation, I stood on the back deck of my modest Denver home, watching the sunset over the Rocky Mountain foothills. The world had changed. I had changed. My cybersecurity consulting business had ironically thrived in the aftermath. The exposure of our family's complex narrative had made me something of an expert in systemic deception detection. Corporations sought my insights. My ability to unravel complex networks of manipulation was now a sought-after skill. Eric had disappeared from public view. Last I'd heard, he was working a mid-level job in a small tech firm in Boise, Idaho. The golden boy had fallen, stripped of the carefully constructed narrative that had defined his entire existence. Our parents had retreated to a small retirement community in Arizona, their social circles dramatically reduced. The legal proceedings had been exhaustive. Financial investigations, potential fraud charges, the ripple effects of our family's exposure continued to spread. Each revelation was like a stone dropped in a still pond, creating waves that touched unexpected shores. I'd learned that truth was never simple. The investigation into Eric's adoption had uncovered layers of complexity that went far beyond our initial understanding. It wasn't just about a single act of deception, but a systematic approach to manufacturing a life. My military background had prepared me for this kind of methodical exposure. Intelligence work wasn't about immediate gratification, it was about patient, precise revelation. Each piece of evidence carefully placed, each truth strategically uncovered. The most unexpected outcome was a series of speaking engagements, corporate, ethics conferences, legal seminars. I became an unexpected expert on systemic deception. My ability to deconstruct complex narratives made me a sought-after speaker. A book deal emerged, not a sensationalist memoir, but a nuanced exploration of identity, family dynamics, and the nature of truth. Publishers saw something deeper in the story. It wasn't just about one family's deception, but about the broader systems that allow such manipulations to occur. My relationship with Eric had become something entirely different. Not hatred, not reconciliation, something more akin to clinical understanding. We were two men who had been products of a complex system, now viewing that system from entirely different perspectives. The veteran support group I joined became an unexpected source of strength. Other veterans understood the concept of exposure, of bringing hidden truths to light. They saw my journey not as an act of revenge, but as a pursuit of fundamental understanding. Financial investigations continued to reveal new layers of complexity. Our parents' careful manipulation extended beyond Eric's adoption. It was a systemic approach to engineering success that had been decades in the making. I discovered something profound about truth. It wasn't a weapon, as I'd once thought. It was a form of liberation. For Eric, for our parents, for myself, the cybersecurity consulting work became my new mission. I specialized in uncovering systemic deceptions, helping corporations and individuals understand the complex networks of manipulation that can exist just beneath the surface. Eric reached out once, a year after everything happened. Not a reconciliation, not an apology, just a brief email asking how I was doing. I responded with a simple acknowledgement. The wounds were too deep for traditional healing. My military training had taught me about resilience, about understanding that life is rarely about winning or losing, but about continuous adaptation. The exposure of our family's narrative was just another mission, challenging, complex, but ultimately survivable. The speaking circuit became an unexpected platform. Corporate ethics conferences, legal seminars, universities interested in understanding systemic deception. I became an unlikely expert on family dynamics and institutional manipulation. Our extended family had fractured completely. Thanksgiving gatherings became impossible. Holiday conversations became minefields of unspoken tension. The network we'd once maintained had collapsed under the weight of revealed truth. The book deal progressed, not a sensationalist expose, but a nuanced exploration of identity, family dynamics, and the nature of truth. Publishers saw something deeper, a story about systemic manipulation that went beyond our personal narrative. I'd learned that redemption wasn't about forgiveness. It was about understanding, about seeing the complex systems that shape human behavior, about recognizing that truth, no matter how painful, was ultimately liberating. As the sun set over Denver, I realized my journey had been about more than exposing a family secret. It had been about understanding the fundamental nature of truth, complex, multi-layered, often uncomfortable, but ultimately transformative. The veteran in me understood something profound. Some missions are about survival, some are about exposure, and some are about understanding the very fabric of human experience. 2 years after the country club revelation, I found myself standing in front of a lecture hall at the University of Colorado, speaking to a room full of aspiring cybersecurity professionals and ethics students. My life had transformed in ways I could never have anticipated. The exposure of our family's complex narrative had become more than just a personal story. It had become a case study in systemic manipulation, identity, and the nature of truth. The speaking engagements had become my new mission. Each presentation was a carefully constructed narrative, not about revenge, but about understanding the intricate systems that shape human experience. My military background and cybersecurity expertise provided a unique lens through which to examine institutional deception. Eric's life had become a distant chapter. The last I'd heard, he was working a mid-level tech job in Boise, far removed from the golden boy narrative that had once defined him. Our parents had retreated to a small retirement community in Arizona, their once expansive social network reduced to a handful of cautious connections. My consulting work had evolved into something more than just tracking digital footprints. I'd become an expert in systemic vulnerability, helping organizations understand the complex networks of manipulation that can exist just beneath the surface of institutional structures. The book was gaining traction, not a sensationalist memoir, but a nuanced exploration of identity, family dynamics, and institutional manipulation. Publishers had recognized something deeper, a story that went beyond our personal narrative to touch on broader human experiences of truth and deception. Veteran support groups became an unexpected source of strength and understanding. Other veterans saw my journey not as an act of personal vendetta, but as a mission of exposure and understanding. They understood the concept of bringing hidden truths to light, of fighting battles that weren't always visible. Financial investigations continued to reveal layers of complexity about our family's approach to manipulation. It wasn't just about Eric's adoption. It was a systematic approach to engineering success that had been decades in the making. The lecture hall was filled with young minds, future cybersecurity professionals, ethics researchers, students hungry for understanding. I spoke about more than just technical skills. I talked about the human element of truth, the complex systems that shape our understanding of identity and success. My cybersecurity consulting had become a platform for broader conversations, corporate ethics workshops, legal seminars, university lectures. I was no longer just telling a family story. I was exploring the fundamental nature of institutional manipulation. The veterans community had embraced me in unexpected ways, speaking engagements at military bases, workshops on institutional integrity. My story had become more than personal. It was a lesson in resilience, in understanding the complex systems that shape human experience. Each presentation was a carefully constructed narrative, not about winning or losing, but about understanding, about recognizing the complex networks of manipulation that exist in families, in corporations, in institutions. The book was more than just a personal story. It had become a text used in university courses, exploring themes of identity, institutional manipulation, the nature of truth. Publishers had recognized something profound in the narrative, a story that went beyond personal experience to touch on broader human conditions. My relationship with Eric remained distant, not hostile, but clinical, an understanding that we were products of a complex system, now viewing that system from entirely different perspectives. The speaking circuit had transformed me from a veteran and cybersecurity consultant to an unexpected expert on systemic deception. Corporations sought my insights. Legal teams consulted my expertise. Universities invited me to share my understanding of complex institutional dynamics. Our extended family had become a distant memory, holiday gatherings impossible, conversations reduced to occasional, cautious communications. The network we'd once maintained had collapsed under the weight of revealed truth. The final I'd learned that redemption wasn't about forgiveness. It was about understanding, about seeing the complex systems that shape human behavior. About recognizing that truth, no matter how painful, was ultimately liberating. As I looked out over the lecture hall, I realized my journey had become something larger than myself. It was about exposing systemic vulnerabilities, about understanding the complex networks that shape human experience. The students listened intently, young minds eager to understand the deeper complexities of truth, of institutional manipulation, of the systems that define human experience. My military training had taught me about mission-driven focus, about understanding that some battles are fought not with weapons, but with information, with exposure, with a relentless pursuit of understanding. The veteran in me understood something profound. Some missions are about survival, some are about exposure, and some are about fundamentally changing how we understand human experience. As I concluded my lecture, I knew my journey was far from over. Each presentation was another mission, another opportunity to expose the complex systems that shape our understanding of truth, of identity, of human potential. The story was still being written, and I was still the author. 3 years after the country club revelation, a sealed envelope arrived at my Denver home. The return address was a lawyer's office in Phoenix, my parents' last known location. The contents would become the final piece of a complex puzzle that had defined our family's existence. My cybersecurity training had taught me to approach information with clinical detachment, but some truths defy emotional distance. Inside the envelope, a series of documents told a story more complicated than anything I'd previously uncovered. Adoption records, financial transactions, personal correspondence that revealed layers of motivation I'd never anticipated. The narrative wasn't just about Eric's manufactured life, it was about the complex system of privilege and manipulation that had created him. My military background had prepared me for unexpected intelligence, Years of parsing complex information in high-stakes environments had given me a unique ability to see beyond surface narratives. This was another mission, one of understanding rather than confrontation. The documents revealed a deeper truth about our parents' motivations. They hadn't just manufactured Eric's success, they had been responding to their own deep-seated failures, generational trauma, unfulfilled ambitions, a desperate attempt to create the perfect child they believed they could never be. My consulting work in cybersecurity had taught me that every system has vulnerabilities. Families were no different, complex networks of relationship, expectation, and hidden motivation. Each document was a vulnerability exposed, a hidden connection revealed. Eric had become a footnote in my larger narrative. Last I'd heard, he was working a modest job in Idaho, far removed from the golden boy persona that had once defined him. Our communication had become sporadic, occasional emails that felt more like diplomatic exchanges than familial connection. The speaking circuit continued. Universities, corporate ethics conferences, legal seminars. I'd become an unexpected expert on systemic deception, on the complex ways families and institutions manufacture narratives of success. These final documents were different. They weren't just about deception, they were about understanding, about seeing the human motivations behind systematic manipulation. My parents hadn't been monsters. They'd been deeply flawed individuals trying to create something perfect in a world that rarely allows perfection. The book had become more than a personal narrative. Academic institutions used it as a case study in institutional manipulation. Ethics courses explored its insights. My story had transcended personal experience to become a broader exploration of human complexity. Veterans support groups continued to provide unexpected support. They understood missions of exposure. They recognized the value of bringing hidden truths to light. My journey resonated with those who understood that some battles are fought with information, not weapons. Financial investigations had revealed intricate networks of manipulation. But these final documents suggested something more nuanced, a desperate attempt to create meaning in a world that often feels meaningless. I thought about the journey, from that moment in the country club to now, a transformation that went beyond exposure. It was about understanding the complex systems that shape human experience. The lecture circuit continued. From university halls to corporate conference rooms, I shared insights about systemic deception, but it was never about judgment, always about understanding. My cybersecurity consulting had evolved. I now helped organizations understand their own vulnerable narratives, how institutions create stories, how families manufacture expectations, how human beings construct their own realities. Eric and I had found a strange form of distant understanding, not reconciliation, not friendship, but a clinical recognition of our shared experience. Two products of a complex system, now viewing that system from different perspectives. The veterans community had become my unexpected support network. They understood missions of exposure. They recognized the value of bringing hidden truths to light. My story resonated with those who knew that some battles are fought with information and understanding. As I sorted through the final documents, I realized my journey had never been about revenge. It had been about understanding, about seeing the complex human motivations behind systematic manipulation. The story wasn't over. It was still being written. Each revelation was another chapter, another opportunity to understand the complex networks that shape human experience. My military training had taught me that intelligence is about more than information. It's about understanding the human systems behind the data, about recognizing that every narrative has multiple layers. The sun set over Denver, casting long shadows across my home office. Another mission completed, another layer of truth revealed, and I was still the author of my own story.